Good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to do today is lift the Ridgeline a little bit. I wanted to kind of show everybody what the level kit can do with the Ridgeline versus the lift kit. So in my case, I ended up picking up the level kit, which raised the front of the truck about 1.5 inches. Makes it look great, but I've realized over time when I have the JSport Mesa bed rack in there and the rooftop tent, the rear squats a little bit. And you'd expect that, right, with that amount of weight, which in and of itself isn't a big deal. But what I am running into is at night when I'm driving, the truck is sitting at an angle that's not making it conducive to other drivers when they're driving towards me in my headlights. So I ended up talking to JSport and picked up the rear spacer to lift the rear of the Ridgeline. So this should be a fairly simple and straightforward installation, but since there's not a lot of videos out there, I thought I'd give it a shot. Enjoy the video to come.
All right, most of this stuff is going to use a 12, and you can see here we needed a 6 Allen wrench, 6mm, to slide into the top of the nut. And then we have the ratchet wrench here, just getting the rest of the bolts off. Obviously up top here, same thing. And then that guy right there. So you're going to have to remove that bolt when we get down to the bottom of the suspension. Taking a look at this bolt here, the top is not threaded, and you'll see why that's important here in a second. So getting down here, we're going to remove the large bolt here on the lower control arm, and then the bottom bolt that's holding in the suspension. You're going to end up using a prybar to separate the knuckle from the control arm. Then once it's out, you can see how much sand and dirt and grossness is on the top of this strut here. So I'm clean it off real quick. And the spacer from JSport, you cannot install it incorrectly, which is great. So the JSport logo right here goes on the top, and it'll slide right on top. You're going to put your 3 bolts back through and bolt it back up to the chassis. All right, reinstalling the lower control arm bolts into the lower strut bolt was pretty straightforward, but we needed to use a jack to align the holes to get the lower control bolt back in. Definitely had to use a pry bar as well as a lot of other things here to be able to reinstall the suspension. So I looked up some directions online to try and figure out what was needed here. All right. So as we come to the end of the video, I wanted to just go over a few thoughts on the installation. As you can see, certainly is raised here a little bit. Again, the JSport spacer or lift kit is 3/4 of an inch in the back. And not only is it meant to help obviously lift the rear of the truck, but it's also meant to assist in the amount of weight that goes on the truck bed when you have the Mesa bed rack on there and a rooftop tent. As far as the installation goes, it was really rough. It was as bad as the front, and the front is a nightmare. Anyone that's put the front on knows that it really is a pain in the butt. So there's a couple things that certainly would be helpful with the directions too, looking at them. You know, the front certainly is pretty straightforward. Using a properly rated jack, raise the front of the vehicle, etc. The rear says none of that. So in order to get off the suspension, you certainly have to take the wheels off, which we did. But in addition to that, you have to loosen the bolt on the lower control arm and then the bolt on the bottom of the suspension before you even take out the 3 up top where you're going to be putting the spacer. Taking them off isn't too bad, but putting them back on with the amount of leverage that you have for the rear suspension, it's really tough. And you know, you maybe could do with one person, but you can see the amount of tools that we ended up having. And I didn't even have both of the jacks in there or the prybar, or I guess the prybar was in there, but I didn't have the crowbar in there. And to have everything line up, I mean, all of those angles need to be just perfect to be able to get the bolts back in for the lower part of the suspension down here. So with that said, maybe a 1 hour job took about 5. So not the easiest thing in the world, but at least it's done, and the look is great. So looking forward to getting the rooftop tent back on the truck, getting out and exploring. All right, taking a look now. The truck has a perfect rake. It's almost equivalent to what the rake is from OEM, which a lot of people will agree that the rake is pretty aggressive straight from Honda. However, with the amount of weight that's going in the truck bed, this is actually going to make the truck look pretty level here once everything is loaded up. But it looks phenomenal right now. I am going to go over the torque specs for all of the bolts, since that's probably pretty important when we're going through the truck suspension here. The axle nut is 242 foot-pounds. The rear strut, the rear strut upper mount is about 25 foot-pounds. The rear strut mounting nut is 135. The rear knuckle mounting bolt is 135. And the rear sway bar end link is only 35. So that should be all of the torque specs. And again, I'm doing this off memory, so I think that's it. But yeah, you know, long story short, I ran into this issue because I had a lot of sand and dirt and grime in the suspension bolts, and that's why it took me as long as it did. But getting everything to line up certainly was a pain. We did get it. The truck looks phenomenal, and the spacer from JSport is really solid. So I'm looking forward to getting out off-road and enjoying it.